Hi, I'm Alex Hayes, and today I'm going to give you a presentation about Brexit and the future of trade. What is our trading relationship going to be with the EU and with the rest of the world, and how will this affect our economy? These are the questions I'm going to explore in today's presentation, and I hope you find it interesting and educational. So here's the structure of today's presentation. I'm going to go through some expert opinion about the impact of Brexit and the trading relationships we're going to achieve. I'm going to give you a case study about what the country of Costa Rica has achieved in terms of trade deals, go through a wildcard option, which we'll get to later, and then summarize. So Chatham House is a mainstream establishment political and economic think tank, and it's been rated by Foreign Policy magazine as the top non-US think tank. Now, they published an analysis of Brexit negotiation possibilities, and I've linked it here, and I'll also put the link below the video if you want to read it for yourself, but I'm going to go through it now in this video. So in their report, Chatham House sets out a number of objectives for a Brexit deal that they think will give us a good chance of a bright future and something that would be a good deal for us. And so the first one is the UK leaving the EU customs union, but the UK and EU agreeing to keep tariffs as low as possible on exported and imported goods. Obviously, this would be beneficial for both the UK and the EU economies, because the more trade we have, the better. And also, something they emphasize is finding ways to avoid the need for physical border checks on UK and EU goods traded across the border, so you wouldn't have to have, for example, trucks being questioned and searched on the way over. It could go straight through, which would obviously, if they had to have border checks, it would be quite a big hindrance and a cost for business. And the second one is that the UK should retain most current EU regulations and standards, so to give us a better access to the EU single market. As Theresa May said, we are leaving the single market, but we want the most access we can. So the more our regulations and standards are similar, the more chance we have of gaining good access to the market. And obviously this is something that frustrates some Eurosceptic people, these regulations and standards, but the more we keep, the better time we'll probably have economically and in a trading. Now, the next set objective is that the UK and EU agree a framework for freedom of movement of people, which gives as much rights of movement as possible, but without being as wide open as it is today. So proposed ideas have included you can move between the two countries, the two areas, only when you have a job offer, or providing limits on family reunions. So often these days you can bring over wives, children, etc. once you have got your personal leave to remain in the UK. Obviously this won't affect things like tourism, but this is for people who want to move for a longer period of time, something which the media doesn't always emphasize correctly. We're always going to be able to travel to the EU for a holiday. And the next one is the UK accepting to make payments to the EU for certain things. So Theresa May emphasised this in her speech the other day when she said we will not be giving the large sums of money we are currently, but we may give money for certain projects. So here it says Pan-European Scientific and Educational Programmes, or EU Regional Support Funds. And obviously the more we give some amounts of money, the more goodwill and the more of a better deal we're likely to get. So those were the objectives they set out for a Brexit deal. Now, the challenges they identify are that it's a difficult and complex process. So we're going to have to negotiate 100, 1,000, or however many different things simultaneously while we're actually leaving in about 18 months, the EU have told us we've got. And we're not used to any of this, so it's quite a difficult process, and that's a big challenge. And then they say another challenge is that although we're currently in line with the EU standards and regulations, these may diverge in the future, and they may design them to favour EU companies. And that once we start diverging and Brexiting and we're further away from the EU, politically speaking, companies may locate their bases of operations within the EU to have access to this single market and also be closer to the political power of the EU. So this could be something rather negative for the UK economy, in that companies move their operations into the EU from the UK. I've heard Dublin come up a few times on the news, or Frankfurt, and so that's something to think about. But they do finish with a note of optimism, I would say. So I'll read this one out in full. The UK would not be starting from square one. There are huge mutual benefits to all concerned to make this process as quick and non-confrontational as possible. And the UK's exclusion from the EU table and loss of influence over the terms of its future access to the EU market will likely be seen in Brussels and EU capitals as sufficient punishment for Brexit. So what they're saying is somewhat similar to what some Leave campaigners have said, which is that the EU and the UK trade so much and it benefits both sides so much that it would be in the EU's best interest to give us a decent deal. And optimistically they're saying that simply not being in the EU and not having a voice at the table may be seen as punishment enough. I'm not sure about that one. They go on. With some political goodwill, as well as huge effort by supporting officials, with legal agility and flexibility, and with compromises on the movement of people and UK payments to the EU, the two sides might be able to conclude a preliminary UK-EU framework agreement in parallel to the UK's EU withdrawal agreement. So they're optimistically saying we could have somewhat of an agreement reached in that 18-month period, which would obviously be excellent for the UK. And the other expert opinion I've got here is the Institute for Fiscal Affairs, which is an economic research institute somewhat similar to a think tank based in London, and then they say they are politically independent. And they produced a document titled Brexit and the UK's Public Finances, and the link's there again, and I'll post it under the video. So they set out 5 options for different levels of Brexit, if you like. So from the top is what people will refer to as the softest Brexit, down to the hardest Brexit at the bottom. So going from the top, EEA membership is something akin to what Norway has at the moment, where they have full access to the single market, but they have to pay into the EU and they don't have a voice at the table, and they have to accept freedom of movement of people and almost all the other rules of the EU. But on the other hand, it probably would have given us the least economic effect of Brexit. But Theresa May has ruled that one out already, so that's not going to happen. So the next one down, the Switzerland option, is just a little harder of a Brexit, where it's a extremely comprehensive bilateral trade agreement, and we would pay something to the EU. We'd have to have some EU rules, but we would have close to EEA levels of access. That one, I would say, also seems somewhat unlikely to happen. The next one down is the Turkey option, which is essentially a normal bilateral trade agreement, plus they have access to the customs union, which means great reduction in things like customs checks on goods. So that's definitely a possibility. Then the next one down is the Canada option, which is basically just a normal free trade agreement, where they have eliminated tariffs on most goods between Canada and the EU, and obviously Canada still has the freedom to make their own rules on trade and to put tariffs on goods and do anything else they like, but they have that tariff-free access to the EU. So that's also something that could definitely happen. And then the hardest Brexit of all is the World Trade Organization rules, which would mean the default tariffs being introduced on goods between the UK and the EU. And for most things, these range between 1 to 2 up to 10 to 15%, averaging about 5% on goods. The highest for agriculture, because the EU really protects the farmers. We'll also see the Common Agricultural Policy for that one. But the World Trade Organization rules are the hardest Brexit and would have the highest tariffs on goods between us and the EU, but also gives us the most freedom to do whatever we want, and no payments would be necessary, of course. So, in the report, there are some GDP forecasts of what would happen with these different Brexit plans. So, there's a high level of uncertainty in these forecasts, obviously. As Mark Carney recently said about the post-Brexit referendum situation, people predicted a lot more chaos than there actually was. Economics is far from a hard science, and so all these things are ultimately unpredictable. But for what it's worth, there are predictions here which are somewhat of a consensus. So these different economic organizations have all predicted what would happen if we had a Canada-Turkey style free trade agreement, or if we had default World Trade Organization tariffs and rules. And as you can see, with the free trade agreement, they're averaging around 3% of a drop in GDP by 2020 compared to where we would have been if we stayed in the EU. And with World Trade Organization rules, an averaging around a drop of about 5% GDP compared to where we would have been, which is quite a decent economic impact. And they compare it in their report to the Euro crisis of 2011 to 2012, but they say it's a lot smaller than the financial crisis of 2008 to 9, which I think was more of a drop closer to 10%. So, I lived through the financial crisis, and it wasn't great, obviously. But if this is a lot smaller of an effect than the financial crisis, I think it's definitely something that is easily survivable. Okay, I'm going to move on to a case study. So Costa Rica, it's a small country in Central America of under 5 million people, and they have negotiated free trade agreements with countries that add up to 66.6% of the world's GDP, including the EU, the USA, and China. Now, some of these are multilateral agreements that are with the group of countries in that area, but a lot of them are actually just bilateral, Costa Rica and that country signing an agreement. And they've also concluded 14 bilateral investment agreements, some of which are with EU member states. So I think that proves that you don't have to be a big country, you don't have to be an important country, you don't have to be a rich country to get good trade deals and sign a lot of trade agreements. I think we'd be in a far, far stronger position than Costa Rica to sign trade agreements. We're one of the top economies in the world, so we could definitely do it. So that's another optimistic note, I'd say. Now, the wildcard option. So, what's happened to manufacturing in our country in the last 40, 50 years? It's dropped massively as a proportion of our total economic output. So as you can see from this graph, in 1970 it was close to 30%. Now it's closer to 10%. Dramatic fall. Now, this is the kind of fall that's reverberated through our political system and through our country. So in places like Wales and Northern England, some of these places have been stripped of jobs and economic prosperity and a future, and people have blamed this on the EU. And it's one of the reasons why Brexit happened. One of the reasons why UKIP has become more popular, because people don't have an economic future and they're looking for someone to blame. And have they reached the right target? Hard to say, but they've reached one, and this is why it's happened. And I think a similar thing in the Rust Belt in America. A lot of them voted Trump because of graphs like this. So what can we do about it? Well, so far in this presentation we've mostly explored reducing or eliminating tariffs and gaining greater economic access and free trade. But there is another option, which is protectionism. So protectionism is raising tariffs on goods. It's making trade harder. And why would you want to do this? Well, because if you, for example, put a 10% or a 20% tariff on cars coming into the UK, then it suddenly becomes economically far more viable to make cars in the UK. And the same with any other good. It supports local and native industry, especially when they're in a weak period or they're just growing. So according to Ha-Jun Chang, who's a well-known economist, almost all of today's rich countries use tariff protection and subsidies to develop their industries. So the UK, the USA, we used to do this, but then we started to do the free trade thing, and suddenly our manufacturing is being shipped over to the Far East or to wherever else. And China is doing this very effectively in the late 20th century and somewhat today as well. That's why they've grown such a powerful and huge manufacturing industry, because they protected it extremely toughly. And so Herman Daly argues that free capital mobility undercuts comparative advantage. So comparative advantage is an economic theory that says certain places are going to be better at producing certain things, or have the right skills or the right resources, etc. So, for example, Scotland makes good whiskey, Japan makes good cars, etc. But they say this Herman Daly says that because capital is so mobile now, the borders between countries are so porous for capital that they can simply go wherever the costs and the labor costs and other costs are lowest, which is what they do: offshoring, outsourcing, etc. And simply go where there's the lowest absolute advantage, which is not good for industry in our country, obviously. So protectionism could be an option we have, especially for the harder set of Brexits, which is looking like where we're going at the moment. We could use these weapons to potentially offset some of the negative effects of Brexit on our economy. So in summary and in conclusion, expert opinion says Brexit's going to be a difficult process, but that a good deal with the EU is an achievable thing. The experts are agreed that there will be a moderate GDP drop compared to where we would have been by 2020, but as with all these predictions, no one really knows. Free trade deals with many countries are a definite possibility. Costa Rica can do it. Why can't we? And protectionist policies are something that we will have in our armory now, because we have it in the EU. We haven't been able to set our own tariffs, but now we will be able to do so. So that's a definite exciting possibility. So I've been Alex Hayes in this video, and thanks for listening to this presentation on Brexit and the future trade deals and the future trade relationships of Britain and the rest of the world. I hope you like this video, and please hit that like button if you do so, and share it to your friends. Thanks very much.